Hello, my dear students, and I want to quickly cover a debriefing and discussion of our lab results, specifically our lab results for the properties of ice. We've been investigating forces that hold atoms together in molecules, and forces that hold molecules together in liquids and in solids, and we've talked a lot about the properties of water, but I want to talk to you more specifically about the properties of solid water or ice. And if you look here, we have a properties of ice lab, and I'm just now able to videotape it and make it available to the virtual students. And for any face-to-face students who might have missed it, we just looked at a couple quick aspects of ice, and you should watch that video if you haven't done the lab or seen these phenomena already. So if you open up that lab and save it, which I've already done, so I'm going to go back to my files here, and I've saved the lab in my files down here at the bottom of my screen. They're in a drive over here as a download, and so I'll quickly go through the lab report and open it up as a PDF and cover a few aspects of the lab, and you'll see the answers near the bottom of the page here. One thing I've included is a picture of the structure of water and ice. Ice has a really regular hexagonal array where each water molecule is bonded to four others. And if you look, it's a very open structure with lots of empty space. It's not air in there. An air molecule won't fit in there. Oxygen won't fit in there. Nitrogen won't fit in there. But it's a very open structure. Whereas water is much more dense, much more compact, and the molecules are freer to move. They roll around each other, and yet if you look closely, they are still all bonded to one another. On average, 3.4 molecules bonded to every other one. A single molecule is bonded to between 3 and 4 molecules. So you saw me add ice to a beaker, and it sunk. It didn't float. We all say, well, we thought ice floats. Why did the ice sink in that beaker when I added the ice to it? Well, the ice sank quite simply because it had a higher density than the liquid in the beaker. And as you should remember from your ice day activity sheet, where I ask you what's the density of water and what's the density of ice, water has a density of approximately 1.9989 or some, value very close to 1, unless you take it out to several places. But it has a value of 1 at 4 degrees C, its densest point. And ice has a density of about 0.919, I want to say, or something like that. It's about 90% of the, a given volume has about 90% of the mass, or ice is about 10% lighter than water. And my answer, and you should say something similar, or you can say the same thing, the ice sank because it had a higher density than the liquid in the beaker, and that also says the liquid could not have been water. And just for your information, it was plain isopropyl alcohol. Now, here comes a dilemma. Paloma has a drink full to the top with ice cubes floating in the drink to keep it cold, and the ice cubes are even extending out over the top, the tip of the iceberg, that 10% that comes over the top. And the question is, what happens to the drink? If she sets her drink down and walks away, does she have to worry about the ice melting and the liquid overflowing and spilling onto the tabletop? Because it's right at the top level of the surface, is even with the top of the glass, and the ice is over the top, a little bit. But does she have to worry about that drink overflowing? And the answer is no, she doesn't have to worry. Because as the ice melts, that liquid water, which has a higher density, that means it has, a mass to volume ratio such that its volume is only going to decrease. Okay? I wrote Paloma's drink will not overflow as the ice melts because liquid water has a higher density, I spelled higher wrong there, than ice, and thus the total volume of that cup will only result in a lower overall volume. And it said, what would happen to lakes and ponds and the fish in them if ice was denser than liquid water and the lakes froze from the bottom up? Well, as that ice forms, as the air cools it down, it would sink to the bottom and slowly fill up the pond or lake. And one thing about you can still freeze from the top down if the lake's shallow or it's cold enough for a long enough time, but it's unlikely and less likely because that ice layer that does form acts as a great insulator for the water underneath, and it stays at 4 degrees. So I wrote the ice would form and sink to the bottom and slowly fill up the pond or lake. And without the insulating effect of the ice, the water could eventually freeze completely. And that would kill all the life, plant and animal life, with some exceptions that we're going to talk about. So what happens when something living freezes? Well, we looked at some lettuce. It's, one example that's fair. I've seen people freeze. We don't do these kinds of experiments anymore. This was 40 years ago. I've seen people freeze goldfish in liquid nitrogen and slam them onto the bench top, and they shatter like broken glass. But it's kind of gruesome, and especially when you think about the cleanup once that thaws. But we use lettuce. I put some lettuce in the freezer, some in the refrigerator, and the lettuce that had been frozen was wilted and old, like old dead lettuce, and lettuce that's been left out for a long time. Freezing the lettuce destroyed the integrity of the plant cells and the tissues and killed them, killed the cells, killed the tissues. The way it works is the ice, as it's forming, forms needles and forms crystals that crush and shear macromolecules and biological structures and organelles and cells themselves. It's not the actual ice swelling that kills them. That 10% change in volume. Most cells can accommodate about that much of a change in volume. But it's the ice damage as they freeze. And just some general information questions I wanted you to Google. What's the temperature inside the average home refrigerator? About 4 degrees Celsius. And what's the temperature inside the average home freezer? About minus 20 degrees Celsius. And what proportion of the Earth's surface is covered in ice? We see those polar ice caps in the Arctic and Antarctic, and we wonder, Greenland is a massive ice sheet as well. We wonder what part of what percent or what proportion of the Earth is covered in ice, which plays an important role in weather and seasons, and it also plays an important role in reflecting a lot of the incident energy from the sun. And about 12% of our surface is permanently covered in ice and snow. And you might say, wow, 12%, that's huge. But people don't realize how incredibly deep and what great temperature sinks and what complex systems the oceans are. That the next question says, what proportion of the Earth's water is frozen in the form of ice? And only about 2%, even though 12% of our surface is covered in snow and ice, and about 2/3 of the Earth's surface is covered in water. Only about 2% of all the Earth's water is frozen. Interesting, at least to me, is that about 70% of all the fresh water, though, on Earth is frozen. And it says, what would happen to lakes and ponds and the fish and other organisms in them if ice was denser than liquid and the lakes froze from the bottom up? And this time I want you to answer this question in terms of the physical effect that being frozen would have on living organisms. And if lakes froze from the bottom up, just answer it simply. The organisms, both plants and animals, would freeze solid. And as ice forms, as you freeze, it crushes and kills cells and tissues, killing the organism. First, it kills the cells and the tissues. If you let your fingers and toes, extremities get frozen, you will kill the cells and kill the tissues, and that tissue will die. It's called frostbite. Very bad for you to be frozen. And if your core, the rest of your body gets frozen, tips of your nose, tips of your ears are also first to go, it could be fatal. And that brings up the question, why is the Pfizer COVID-19 vaccine required to be kept at minus 80 degrees Celsius? Well, as I've said, as those ice crystals form, they pierce membranes and crush and shear other macromolecules. And the Pfizer vaccine is a very fragile messenger RNA strand that's encapsulated in a lipid membrane called a liposome. And rapid freezing makes the ice all freeze at once. And you get rapid freezing by freezing very quickly at an extremely low temperature, like minus 80. And when you have that extreme low temperature, and you form the ice all at once, you get that nice open ice structure, and you don't get the ice damage. So when we freeze, for example, embryos or, freeze tissues or cell lines or things, we freeze them very frequently in liquid nitrogen, minus 78 degrees, approximately minus 80 degrees Celsius. So rapid freezing, extreme low temperature storage prevents the ice damage. Remember this open and closed structure for liquid water on the left and ice on the right. And I have a picture of something called an Arctic cod. It's not really a cod. I forget what kind of fish it is, but that's its name. And we added some different things to melt the ice more quickly and to lower the temperature of our system. We added salt and alcohol to our systems, and I just said, what's your experimental data? What temperature was water and ice? And it's almost always 4 degrees Celsius if you have a good mix of water and ice. The water under the ice in a lake is about 4 degrees Celsius, 3.8 or something like that, but 4 degrees for our purposes. And what temperature was the water and salt solution? Well, just adding a little salt to our water and ice solution, we took that temperature down below freezing to minus 6 degrees. And adding the alcohol did much the same thing. You have to play with it to get the ratios right to and you can reach even significantly lower temperatures, minus 20 or so with some of these systems if you design them and set them up right. But the water and alcohol was 2 degrees Celsius, minus 2 degrees, below freezing again. So what happens to the ice when you add it to a liquid? Well, the ice melts and the liquid cools. The ice is extracting energy from it, and I ask you to describe that process in this question number 5 about what happens energetically to the components of the system when the ice is added to the liquids. Excuse me for zooming around there. Well, in, I guess, partially or not too detailed scientific terms, what's happening is as ice melts, it's absorbing thermal energy from its surroundings in that process. And when thermal energy is removed from the surrounding environment, that environment cools down. And the Arctic cod, pictured above, lives in the Antarctic Ocean water. Like many of this class of fish called notothenoids, those are sometimes called antifreeze fish. They're marine fish species. There's about 120 different ones of them, which are native to Arctic and Arctic waters. And they survive in extreme cold, in temperatures below freezing even. And these Arctic and Antarctic fish have specialized proteins in their tissues and blood that we call antifreeze proteins. They act as antifreeze and prevent freezing by depressing the freezing point of water. So the water in their blood won't freeze, and they can survive those very cold temperatures. Very unique group of organisms. I'm not sure I would eat one, but that concludes our discussion of the lab. I hope you've learned something and you have a greater appreciation for water and ice. And until we see each other again, whether it's face to face or virtually, I will say stay safe and take care for now. And we will see you in the next one.